Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a sleeping pill that was supposedly safer than sugar. A drug so harmless that doctors recommended it to pregnant women like vitamin supplements. The pharmaceutical company claimed you literally couldn't overdose on it even if you tried. Mothers took it for morning sickness, anxiety, insomnia, whatever ailed them during those delicate 9 months. The pills came in cheerful packaging. Advertisements showed peaceful sleeping faces, and then babies started being born without arms, without legs. Some had flippers instead of limbs, others had no limbs at all. Over 10,000 children across 46 countries emerged from the womb as living evidence that completely safe meant absolutely nothing. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand how thalidomide destroyed thousands of lives, you first need to understand the desperation of post-war Germany. The year was 1945, and the country lay in ruins, physically, economically, morally. Cities existed as rubble fields. Industry had collapsed. The Nazi regime's chemical experiments left a bitter taste, yet Germany's pharmaceutical sector somehow needed to rebuild itself into something respectable, into something profitable. Enter Chemie Grunenthal, a small pharmaceutical company in Stolberg founded by Hermann Wirtz in 1946. Wirtz had zero pharmaceutical experience. His background was soap and cosmetics. The company initially produced antibiotics under license, generating modest income while searching for something bigger, something original. The pharmaceutical gold rush of the 1950s promised fortunes to anyone who could synthesize the next blockbuster drug. Their research team was small, ambitious, underfunded. Lead chemist Wilhelm Kuntz had been experimenting with peptides, chains of amino acids that might yield useful compounds. Most experiments failed. Some produced substances with no apparent use. One particular compound, synthesized in 1953, seemed utterly worthless. It wouldn't kill bacteria, it wouldn't reduce fever, it wouldn't do much of anything interesting, except make you sleepy. Someone at Grunenthal, history doesn't record exactly who, noticed the compound's sedative properties during routine testing. Not dramatic sedation, just calm, gentle drowsiness. Kunz refined the synthesis, and by 1954, thalidomide emerged as a distinct chemical entity, alpha-thalidomide. The name sounded impressively scientific. The molecule structure looked elegant on paper. The company now faced a critical decision. Bringing any drug to market required testing, documentation, regulatory approval. Proper trials cost money and time, resources Grunenthal desperately lacked. Competitors were flooding markets with new sedatives, tranquilizers, sleeping pills. The barbiturate market alone was worth millions. Speed mattered more than caution. So they tested thalidomide on rodents, mice mostly. Some rats. The animals received massive doses and survived. No immediate deaths occurred. Hearts kept beating, livers kept functioning. To Grunenthal's researchers, this meant safety. The compound appeared non-toxic according to the crude standards of 1950s pharmacology. What they didn't test was pregnant animals. Nobody thought to dose expecting mothers and observe the offspring. Reproductive toxicology barely existed as a field. The idea that a drug could cross the placenta and damage developing fetuses seemed theoretical, distant, not worth expensive investigation. Animal pregnancy studies would delay launch by months, maybe years. The company made its choice. Economic survival trumped scientific rigor. Grunenthal declared thalidomide safe based on tests so minimal they'd be laughable by modern standards. No long-term studies, no chronic exposure data, no teratogenicity screening, just some mice that didn't die immediately. But there was genius in their next move. Rather than position thalidomide as just another sleeping pill competing with established barbiturates, Grunenthal's marketing team identified a fatal flaw in existing sedatives: overdose risk. Barbiturates killed thousands annually through intentional and accidental poisoning. Housewives struggling with too many pills simply stopped breathing. The drugs were effective but dangerous. Thalidomide, according to Grunenthal's limited rodent data, couldn't kill you no matter how much you swallowed. The lethal dose appeared impossibly high. This became their revolutionary selling point: a sleeping pill without death risk, safety incarnate. The company began calling it astonishingly safe and completely non-toxic in internal documents. They branded it Contigan for the German market. The name sounded modern, scientific, trustworthy. Packaging featured soothing colours. The tablets came in appealing shapes. Everything about Contigan's presentation screamed harmless efficacy. Heinrich Muchter, Grunenthal's research director, pushed for rapid approval. Muchter had his own complicated past, wartime work that wasn't discussed openly. Many German pharmaceutical executives carried similar histories they preferred buried. The company culture valued results over questions. Nobody wanted delays, scrutiny, or inconvenient ethical debates about proper testing protocols. German regulatory requirements in the mid-1950s were remarkably lax compared to modern standards. No equivalent of the FDA existed. Companies largely self-regulated. If your internal tests suggested safety, authorities accepted your word. The devastation of thalidomide would eventually change this system entirely. But in 1954, Grunenthal faced minimal bureaucratic obstacles. They submitted their application with confidence. The documentation was thin but sufficient for the era. Regulators reviewed the rodent survival data and found nothing alarming. Why would they? The mice lived. The compound seemed benign. German authorities approved Contigan for market in October 1957. But Grunenthal had bigger ambitions than Germany alone. The global pharmaceutical market beckoned. Britain's massive National Health Service meant millions of potential prescriptions. America offered even larger profits. Australia, Canada, Japan, across Europe. Everywhere that people struggled to sleep represented opportunity. The company began licensing Contigan to foreign partners under different brand names. Distillers Company would market it as Distaval in Britain. Richardson Merrill would seek American approval under the name Kevadon. Other companies picked up rights for their territories. Each partner received the same minimal safety data and the same marketing message. Safer than existing sedatives, no overdose risk, perfectly suitable for anyone including the most vulnerable patients. That last point became crucial. Grunenthal specifically targeted pregnant women as ideal customers. Morning sickness plagued expectant mothers worldwide. Anxiety during pregnancy was common. Sleep disturbances affected nearly every pregnant woman. Yet existing medications came with warnings and risks that made doctors hesitant to prescribe them. Contigan appeared to solve this problem perfectly. If the drug truly couldn't cause overdose, if it really was completely non-toxic, then pregnant women could take it without worry. The company's marketing materials increasingly featured expectant mothers. Print advertisements showed pregnant women sleeping peacefully. Medical representatives visiting doctors emphasized Contigan's suitability for obstetric use. No studies had actually tested thalidomide's safety during pregnancy. None. The leap from mice don't die to safe for developing human fetuses was pure assumption. Grunenthal simply declared it safe and marketed accordingly. Doctors, trusting the company's claims, began prescribing Contigan to pregnant patients by the thousands. The drug's actual effects were genuinely pleasant for users. It did induce sleep effectively. Patients woke feeling refreshed rather than groggy. No hangover effect occurred. No addiction developed even with regular use. Women taking Contagun for morning sickness reported relief. The drug seemed to work exactly as promised. Sales exploded beyond Grunenthal's most optimistic projections. Within a year of German launch, Contagun became one of the country's best-selling pharmaceuticals. Doctors prescribed it enthusiastically. Pharmacies stocked it prominently. Patients requested it by name. The company's revenues soared. Success bred expansion. By 1958, thalidomide was available in a dozen countries. By 1959, that number doubled. By 1960, 46 nations had approved some version of the drug under various brand names. Global sales reached tens of millions of tablets monthly. Grunenthal's gamble on speed over thorough testing appeared brilliantly vindicated. The company's executives celebrated their triumph. Trade journals praised Grunenthal's innovation. Medical conferences featured papers on thalidomide's remarkable safety profile. The drug represented everything pharmaceutical companies dreamed of: effective, profitable, generating positive publicity while solving real medical problems. Nobody noticed the first deformities. Birth defect occurred occasionally even without drug exposure. A baby born without a fully formed ear might be chalked up to random developmental failure. Shortened limbs could be genetic. When such cases appeared sporadically across different hospitals in different cities, no pattern emerged to alert anyone. The invisible catastrophe was already unfolding. Somewhere in Germany during late 1958 or early 1959, a woman took Contagun during the critical window of pregnancy when limbs begin forming. Between days 35 and 50 of gestation, a fetus develops the basic structure of arms and legs. Thalidomide disrupts this process in ways that wouldn't be understood for years. The drug interferes with blood vessel formation in developing limbs. Without proper vascularization, limb buds fail to grow normally. That first affected baby was born without anyone understanding the cause. Then another, and another. The deformities varied but shared strange similarities. Medical literature had names for some conditions. Phocomelia meant seal-like flippers instead of normal limbs. Amelia meant complete absence of limbs. But these conditions were supposed to be extraordinarily rare. Textbooks listed them as curiosities, genetic aberrations occurring perhaps once in 100,000 births. Suddenly, doctors in Hamburg, Munich, Berlin were seeing multiple cases annually. The numbers were climbing. Something was wrong, but what? Genetic diseases don't suddenly spike across entire populations. Environmental toxins might explain it, but which toxin? West Germany's industrial reconstruction involved countless chemicals, any of which might be culpable. The deformed babies kept coming. Their mothers, devastated and confused, searched for explanations that medical professionals couldn't provide. Meanwhile, Grunenthal continued shipping millions of tablets monthly. The company's marketing grew more aggressive. They promoted Contagun as ideal for children's sleep problems. They suggested it for elderly patients. They positioned it as the universal safe sedative for any situation. By 1960, thalidomide had become one of the most successful pharmaceutical products in the world. Grunenthal earned fortunes. Partner companies across 46 countries shared the profits. Millions of patients relied on the drug. Thousands of pregnant women took it daily, trusting their doctors' recommendations and the company's safety claims. Nobody at Grunenthal knew they'd created a monster. The executives celebrating record profits couldn't imagine that their completely safe drug was actively deforming thousands of developing fetuses at that exact moment. Women swallowing Contagun for morning sickness had no idea they were poisoning their unborn children. Doctors prescribing it believed they were providing harmless relief. The machinery of disaster was fully operational, invisible, unstoppable. Each day's sales created tomorrow's tragedies. The gap between cause and effect, between pill consumption and birth defect, masked the connection. By the time affected babies emerged months later, mothers couldn't remember all the medications they'd taken during early pregnancy. Pattern recognition became nearly impossible. Wilhelm Kunz, the chemist who synthesized thalidomide, certainly never imagined his compound would become synonymous with pharmaceutical horror. Heinrich Müchter, pushing for rapid approval, didn't foresee that his name would later appear in criminal investigations. Hermann Wirtz, the soap maker turned pharmaceutical entrepreneur, couldn't have predicted his company would face prosecution for causing history's worst drug disaster. They were simply businessmen exploiting an opportunity in post-war Germany's desperate economy. They cut corners that seemed reasonable at the time. They made assumptions that appeared justified by limited data. They prioritized speed and profit over exhaustive safety testing, because that's what competitive markets rewarded. And they were about to learn that nature doesn't forgive shortcuts. The human body, especially in its most vulnerable developmental stages, operates according to rules that ignore corporate ambitions and economic pressures. Thalidomide was already written into thousands of developing bodies as genetic damage, structural deformity, lifelong disability. The reckoning was coming. October 1st, 1957 marked Contigan's official German launch. Grunenthal deployed a marketing campaign unprecedented in pharmaceutical history. The company hired an army of medical representatives, over 200 in Germany alone. These salespeople descended on doctors' offices carrying briefcases stuffed with free samples, glossy brochures, and one irresistible message: this drug cannot kill your patients. The pitch evolved into an art form. Representatives arrived with data showing mice surviving doses 50 times the therapeutic amount. They brought testimonials from early prescribers. They emphasized how barbiturate overdoses filled emergency rooms while Contigan promised 0 such incidents. Suicide prevention became part of the sales narrative. Depressed patients couldn't harm themselves with this medication even if they tried. Doctors found the proposition compelling. General practitioners dealt constantly with anxious patients, exhausted mothers, elderly insomniacs. Prescribing barbiturates meant accepting the risk that someone might intentionally or accidentally take too many pills. Contigan eliminated that liability. The choice seemed obvious. But Grunenthal's true genius lay in identifying their perfect customer demographic. Pregnant women represented a largely untapped market. They suffered intensely from specific ailments: nausea, vomiting, anxiety, sleep disruption. Yet pharmaceutical options remained limited because most drugs carried pregnancy warnings. Doctors hesitated to prescribe anything that might theoretically harm a fetus. Contigan's marketing materials increasingly featured pregnant women as ideal users. One advertisement showed an expectant mother sleeping peacefully with a caption emphasizing complete safety. Another depicted a glowing pregnant woman holding Contigan tablets, with text suggesting relief without risk. The message couldn't be clearer. This drug was specifically appropriate for pregnancy. Medical representatives visiting obstetricians and gynecologists pushed this angle aggressively. They left behind prescription pads pre-printed with Contigan's name. They provided free samples by the hundreds. Some doctors received so many complimentary tablets they could supply patients for months without writing a single paid prescription. The strategy worked devastatingly well. Within 6 months of launch, German obstetricians were prescribing Contigan as routinely as prenatal vitamins. Women in their first trimester, suffering through morning sickness, received prescriptions almost automatically. The drug became standard care for pregnancy-related complaints. Sales figures reflected this success. Contigan climbed to become West Germany's best-selling over-the-counter sedative by mid-1958. Grunenthal couldn't manufacture tablets fast enough. Production facilities expanded, new synthesis lines opened. The company hired additional chemists just to maintain supply. International expansion accelerated dramatically. Distillers Company launched Distaval in Britain during August 1958. The British marketing campaign mirrored Germany's approach, but with even greater intensity. Distillers positioned Distaval as the perfect drug for the National Health Service era. Safe, effective, impossible to abuse. British doctors, working within NHS budgets and formularies, embraced the apparently ideal sedative. British advertisements went further than German ones. Some showed mothers with young children, suggesting Distaval for postpartum anxiety. Others featured elderly couples, marketing it for geriatric sleep problems. The company produced educational films for medical schools showing Distaval's supposed safety advantages. University hospitals received grant funding to study the drug, though these studies focused on effectiveness rather than safety. Australia received thalidomide in early 1959 under the brand name Distaval, same as Britain. Canadian approval followed. Japanese pharmaceutical companies licensed it as Isoman. Sweden marketed it as Neurosedin. Portugal called it Softenon. Each country's version came with identical safety claims and similar marketing targeting pregnant women. The global pharmaceutical industry watched Grunenthal's success with mixture of admiration and envy. Trade publications ran case studies analysing the marketing campaign's brilliance. Business schools began teaching Contigan's launch as an example of effective product positioning. The drug became a model for how to rapidly penetrate international markets. Meanwhile, Richardson Merrill in Cincinnati prepared their American application. The US market represented the ultimate prize: wealthier patients, higher prices, massive prescribing volumes. If Kevadon gained FDA approval, Richardson Merrill projected $100 million in annual American sales alone. The company assembled its regulatory submission with confidence, having watched thalidomide's triumph across Europe. By 1960, conservative estimates suggested over 1 million people took some form of thalidomide regularly. Actual numbers likely reached several million considering over-the-counter sales in some countries, and the difficulty tracking prescription volumes across 46 different markets. The drug had become ubiquitous. Pregnant women represented a substantial portion of users. Exact figures remain unknown, but based on prescription patterns and marketing focus, tens of thousands of expectant mothers consumed thalidomide during 1958 through 1960. Some took it throughout pregnancy. Others used it only during first trimester morning sickness. A few swallowed just a handful of tablets before discontinuing. The critical exposure window was brutally narrow. Days 35 through 50 of gestation represented peak vulnerability. During this 15-day period, human embryos develop limb buds that will become arms and legs. Thalidomide interferes with angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels. Without adequate blood supply, developing limb buds fail to grow properly. The severity of deformity depended on precise timing. Taking thalidomide on day 35 might destroy arm development. Day 40 affected legs. Day 45 damaged hands and feet. Some women took the drug during multiple days within the window, creating complex combinations of deformities. Others missed the critical period entirely and delivered normal babies despite thalidomide use. This randomness prevented early detection. A woman taking Contigan throughout pregnancy might birth a healthy child if she started after day 50. Another consuming just 2 tablets on day 38 could deliver a baby without arms. The lack of dose-response relationship confused everyone. Some heavily exposed pregnancies ended normally, while minimal exposure sometimes caused catastrophic damage. Doctors delivering affected babies saw no pattern initially. Each case appeared isolated. Hamburg's University Hospital recorded 3 phocomelia births in 1959 compared to 0 in the previous decade. Munich documented 5. Berlin saw 4. The numbers seemed insignificant, spread across thousands of annual deliveries. Medical staff attributed the increase to random variation or improved record keeping. Nobody connected these births to thalidomide because the drug had been marketed for several years before deformities appeared. The gap between Contigan's 1957 launch and the first affected births in late 1959 created a deceptive sense of safety. If the drug caused birth defects, surely they would have appeared immediately. But pregnancy mathematics worked against detection. Women conceiving in October 1957 delivered in July 1958, before many doctors began routinely prescribing Contigan for morning sickness. The marketing campaign needed months to penetrate medical practice. Peak prescribing to pregnant women occurred during late 1958 and throughout 1959. These pregnancies produced affected babies in 1959 and 1960. The disaster was perfectly timed to avoid early warning. Grunenthal sold millions of tablets before birth defects reached noticeable levels. By the time patterns might have emerged, thalidomide had become so established that blaming it seemed absurd. Reputable pharmaceutical companies didn't sell drugs that destroyed babies. Regulatory agencies wouldn't approve such medications. The assumption of safety was deeply entrenched. Grunenthal's confidence bordered on arrogance. Company executives gave media interviews praising Contigan as their greatest achievement. Heinrich Müchter published papers in medical journals discussing thalidomide's remarkable safety profile. Marketing materials began claiming the drug was safer than sugar, a phrase that would later seem grotesquely ironic. The company even expanded indications. Initially marketed just for sleep and anxiety, Contigan now carried suggestions for coughs, colds, headaches, tension. Some advertisements implied it could treat almost any minor ailment. Grunenthal's message was clear. Thalidomide was so safe it could be used for practically anything. German pharmacies began stocking Contigan as an over-the-counter product in some regions. No prescription required. Anyone could purchase it like aspirin. Parents bought it for children's sleep problems. Elderly patients took it for insomnia. Teenagers used it for exam anxiety. The drug penetrated every demographic. British sales matched German success. Distaval became one of the NHS's most prescribed medications by 1960. Distiller's company earned substantial profits while positioning themselves as socially responsible by providing an abuse-proof sedative. Their advertisements emphasized how Distaval protected public health by eliminating overdose deaths. Australian doctors prescribed it enthusiastically. Japanese sales climbed steadily. Canadian physicians recommended it routinely. Across continents, thalidomide had achieved what pharmaceutical companies dream of: near universal medical acceptance as a safe, effective solution to common problems. The invisible catastrophe was reaching its peak. During 1960, the highest number of pregnant women consumed thalidomide during critical developmental windows. Thousands of fetuses were being exposed simultaneously. The drug was crossing placentas, entering fetal circulation, attacking developing blood vessels in tiny limb buds. Some embryos lost all 4 limbs, others developed flipper-like appendages. Many suffered ear deformities, often missing external ears entirely. Internal organs grew abnormally in some cases. The damage varied wildly, but shared common features: disrupted development during precise gestational moments, and still nobody knew. Grunenthal continued shipping tablets. Distillers expanded production. Richardson Merrill pushed for American approval. Medical representatives distributed free samples. Doctors wrote prescriptions. Pregnant women swallowed pills. trusting that modern medicine wouldn't harm them or their babies. The machine of commerce ground forward, indifferent to the biological destruction happening in darkness. Marketing budgets funded more advertisements. Sales conferences celebrated record-breaking quarters. Pharmaceutical executives received bonuses for exceptional performance. In hospitals across Western Germany, midwives were beginning to whisper among themselves. Something seemed wrong. More babies with strange limbs, more missing ears, more incomprehensible deformities. But midwives held low status in medical hierarchies. Their observations carried little weight. Doctors, confident in pharmaceutical safety and regulatory oversight, dismissed concerns as superstition or pattern-seeking in random events. The perfect storm had fully formed. An inadequately tested drug had been marketed with unprecedented aggression, specifically targeting the most vulnerable population, supported by regulatory systems unprepared to catch such dangers, sold by a company prioritizing profits over caution, prescribed by doctors trusting institutional safeguards, consumed by women believing they were making safe choices. Every element necessary for catastrophe was present. The only missing ingredient was recognition. Someone needed to see the pattern. Someone had to connect the dots between medication and malformation. Someone had to be willing to accuse a respectable pharmaceutical company of causing the unthinkable. That recognition was coming, but not yet. Not quite yet. For now, thalidomide's triumph seemed complete and unassailable. Late November 1959, Hamburg neurologist Ralph Voss examined a patient complaining of numbness in both hands. The sensation had appeared gradually over several weeks. Routine examination revealed decreased reflexes and diminished peripheral sensation. Voss ordered standard neurological tests, finding nothing obvious. He asked about recent medications. The patient mentioned Contigan for insomnia. Voss noted this but thought little of it initially. Peripheral neuropathy had multiple causes: diabetes, vitamin deficiencies, autoimmune conditions. A sleeping pill seemed unlikely culprit. Then another patient arrived with identical symptoms, same progressive numbness, same pattern of sensory loss, also taking Contigan. Voss's clinical instincts activated. 2 cases with the same medication suggested correlation. He began systematically reviewing his caseload, discovering 4 additional patients with peripheral neuropathy, all using Contigan regularly. Voss published a cautious letter in a German medical journal during early 1960. He suggested Contigan might cause nerve damage with prolonged use. The pharmaceutical world barely noticed. Minor side effects were common in all medications. Nerve tingling seemed trivial compared to barbiturate overdose deaths. Grunenthal issued a brief statement acknowledging the possibility while emphasizing the drug's overall safety profile. Sales continued climbing. The nerve damage reports failed to slow Contigan's momentum because the symptoms were reversible and relatively mild. Patients who stopped taking the drug generally recovered sensation within weeks or months. This seemed like acceptable risk for a non-addictive sedative, but something far worse was emerging in obstetric wards. December 25, 1959, Christmas Day in Hamburg's maternity hospital. A midwife delivered a baby girl who appeared normal except for one disturbing detail. She had no external ears, just smooth skin where ear structure should exist. The child could hear through internal mechanisms, but the visible absence shocked the delivery room staff. Pediatrician Widukin Lenz examined the infant. He'd practiced obstetrics for 15 years without encountering such a case. Medical literature classified anosia, absence of external ears, as extremely rare, perhaps 1 in 20,000 births. The condition typically appeared alongside other genetic syndromes. This baby showed no other abnormalities. Lentz filed the case as a curiosity and moved on. January 1960 brought more typical winter delivery volumes. February passed normally. Then May arrived with 3 births that stopped Lentz cold. The first baby had drastically shortened arms ending in flipper-like appendages, phocomelia, seal limbs. Lentz had read about this condition in textbooks but never seen it personally. Medical schools taught phocomelia as a historical oddity, so rare that most practitioners never encountered a single case during entire careers. The second affected infant was born 2 days later at the same hospital. This baby had normal arms but legs that ended at the knees with small, poorly formed feet, attached directly to the stumps. The deformity defied standard classification. It resembled phocomelia, but affected lower limbs rather than upper ones. Baby number 3 arrived the following week without arms at all. Complete bilateral amelia. The limbs simply weren't there. 2 small bumps protruded from the shoulders where arms should have developed. Otherwise, the child appeared healthy. Normal head, proper organ function, responsive and alert. 3 catastrophic limb deformities in 3 weeks. Lentz began reviewing hospital records frantically. Hamburg's facility delivered roughly 3,000 babies annually. Historical data showed maybe 1 phocomelia case per decade. Now 3 in a month. He contacted colleagues at other German hospitals. Munich reported similar increases. A pediatrician in Münster mentioned seeing 2 phocomelia cases recently after years without any. Berlin's Charité Hospital had documented 4 unusual limb deformities during the past 6 months. The pattern was emerging across West Germany. Lentz started interviewing mothers of affected babies. He asked about everything: illnesses during pregnancy, medications taken, environmental exposures, family histories, dietary habits. The questionnaires were exhaustive. Most mothers couldn't remember every detail, but Lentz persisted. One commonality surfaced repeatedly, not universal, but frequent enough to notice. Many mothers had taken Contagon during early pregnancy for morning sickness or sleep problems. Lentz initially dismissed this correlation because Contagon was so widely used. Millions of women took it. Finding it in affected mothers' histories proved nothing statistically, but the frequency bothered him. He refined his questioning, focusing on specific timing. When exactly did mothers start Contagon? How long did they continue? What trimester were they in? A pattern crystallized. Mothers reporting Contagon use had typically taken it during the first trimester, often beginning around week 5 or 6 of pregnancy. This coincided precisely with the critical period of limb development. The overlap seemed too specific to ignore. Australian obstetrician William McBride was reaching identical conclusions simultaneously on the opposite side of the planet. Sydney's Crown Street Women's Hospital had seen a dramatic spike in limb deformities during 1960. McBride, meticulous and observant, noticed the trend immediately. He began his own investigation, interviewing affected babies' mothers with the same thoroughness Lentz employed in Germany, and he found the same medication appearing repeatedly: Disdaval, the British brand name for thalidomide. Australian women, like their German counterparts, had taken the drug for pregnancy-related complaints during early gestation. McBride contacted Distiller's company in Britain with his concerns. The company response was swift and dismissive. Their animal study showed no problems. Thousands of women had safely used Disdaval during pregnancy. McBride's correlation was coincidental at best, perhaps reflecting increased awareness rather than genuine increase in deformities. The company pointed out that McBride had no controlled study, no statistical analysis, just anecdotal observations from his own practice. This wasn't real evidence. Birth defects occurred randomly. Finding a common medication among mothers proved nothing when that medication was prescribed to millions. McBride backed down temporarily, uncertain. Perhaps the company was right. Perhaps he was seeing patterns in noise. The polite but firm pushback from a major pharmaceutical company made him question his clinical instincts. Lentz faced similar resistance. He approached Grunenthal directly in late 1960 with preliminary findings. He had now documented 14 cases of severe limb deformities at his hospital, with 10 mothers reporting Contagon use during early pregnancy. The company's response combined courtesy with condescension. Grunenthal's medical director explained patiently that correlation didn't equal causation. Contagon had been extensively tested on animals, with no teratogenic effects observed. The drug had been on the market for 3 years with millions of exposures. If it caused birth defects, surely this would have been noticed earlier. The company produced their animal studies, rats and mice exposed to thalidomide showing normal offspring. They cited the peripheral neuropathy issue as evidence of their transparency and willingness to acknowledge genuine side effects. But birth defects? The suggestion was scientifically unsupported. Grunenthal went further. They noted that birth defect rates naturally varied. Some years showed higher incidences than others, for reasons nobody fully understood. Environmental factors, viral infections, improved diagnostic techniques, better record keeping. Any of these could explain apparent increases without implicating their drug. The company also pointed out that Lentz's sample size was statistically insignificant. 14 cases from one hospital couldn't establish causation. Where were the rigorous epidemiological studies? Where was the controlled data? Lentz had suspicions, not evidence. This response was calculated and effective. Grunenthal understood that definitive proof would take years to establish. Conducting proper retrospective studies, analysing birth registries, controlling for confounding variables. This work required time, funding, and institutional support. Meanwhile, Contagon sales continued generating millions in revenue. The company launched a preemptive public relations strategy. They issued statements to medical journals emphasizing Contagon's proven safety record. They sent medical representatives to doctors with updated literature showing animal studies and reassuring safety data. They positioned Lenz and any similar skeptics as alarmists drawing unwarranted conclusions from limited observations. British medical authorities received similar treatment when concerns arose. A handful of doctors across the UK had noticed unusual limb deformities and questioned Distaval's role. Distiller's Company responded with identical tactics: cite animal studies, question sample sizes, emphasize correlation versus causation, suggest alternative explanations. The strategy worked remarkably well. Most doctors accepted the company's explanations. Thalidomide had been approved by regulatory agencies. Reputable pharmaceutical companies stood behind it. The scientific establishment validated it. Questioning such a successful drug based on small case series seemed professionally risky. Lentz found himself increasingly isolated. Colleagues suggested he was overreacting. Hospital administrators worried about reputational damage if their physician made unfounded accusations against major pharmaceutical companies. The medical establishment preferred caution and skepticism over premature alarm, but babies kept arriving with destroyed limbs. June 1960 brought 2 more cases to Hamburg. July added 3. August saw 4 Phocomelia births in a single week. The numbers were accelerating beyond any possibility of random variation. Lentz expanded his data collection, contacting pediatricians across West Germany. He created detailed case reports documenting each affected birth dates, mother's medical history, medication timelines, severity of deformities. He built a database that grew more damning with each entry. By September 1960, he documented over 30 cases personally, with reports of dozens more from colleagues. The pattern was undeniable to anyone examining the data objectively. Mothers who took Contagon during gestational days 35 to 50 had dramatically elevated risk of delivering babies with limb deformities. The specificity was remarkable and terrifying. Take Contagon before day 35 or after day 50. Usually no problems. Take it during that narrow window. Substantial risk of catastrophic damage. The drug wasn't randomly harmful. It attacked one specific developmental process during one specific time frame. Lentz contacted Grunenthal again with expanded data. The company response turned hostile. They threatened legal action for defamation. Their lawyers sent letters warning that unfounded accusations could result in substantial lawsuits. Grunenthal framed Lentz's persistence as professional misconduct bordering on harassment. The intimidation was effective. Hospital administrators pressed Lentz to drop the issue, or at least stop naming Grunenthal publicly. He was damaging relationships with a major pharmaceutical company. He was creating legal liability for the hospital. He needed to either produce definitive proof or cease making allegations. McBride in Australia faced identical pressure. Distillers Company sent stern communications warning about reputational damage and potential legal consequences. They reminded him that medicine required rigorous scientific proof, not hunches based on limited observations. Both doctors found themselves trapped. They had clinical certainty based on overwhelming correlations, but not the controlled studies that pharmaceutical companies and regulatory agencies demanded. Conducting such studies would take years. Meanwhile, every month brought more deformed babies. The situation created a perfect stalemate. Doctors saw the damage but lacked institutional power to force drug withdrawal. Pharmaceutical companies demanded proof standards that conveniently required extensive time to meet. Regulatory agencies, having already approved the drugs, hesitated to reverse those decisions without unassailable evidence. And thalidomide's marketing machine never slowed. Grunenthal spent October and November 1960 launching new advertising campaigns. They introduced Contagon in additional formulations, liquid suspensions for children, combination pills for multiple symptoms, extended-release versions for all-night sedation. Sales projections for 1961 predicted record-breaking revenues. The company was winning. Their drug-dominated markets across 46 countries. A few doctors raising concerns barely registered as threats. The pharmaceutical establishment had their back, but the evidence was becoming impossible to suppress. Every maternity ward in Germany now whispered about the Phocomelia babies. Midwives compared notes. Nurses exchanged worried glances. The deformities were too frequent, too distinctive, too concentrated in time to be coincidental. Someone was going to break the stalemate. Someone would find a way to prove what clinicians already knew. The question wasn't whether thalidomide would fall, but when and how many more babies would be destroyed before it happened. September 1960, Washington, D.C. The Food and Drug Administration received new drug application 10627 from Richardson Merrill Pharmaceutical Company. The submission requested approval for Kevadon, thalidomide's proposed American brand name. The application landed on the desk of Dr. Francis Oldham Kelsey, who had started working at the FDA exactly 2 weeks earlier. Kelsey was 46 years old, Canadian by birth, with a medical degree and a PhD in pharmacology. Her career had included research positions and teaching roles, but FDA reviewing represented new territory. The agency assigned her to Kevadon as a relatively straightforward case. European success suggested easy approval. Her supervisors expected the application processed within 60 days. Richardson Merrill anticipated similar speed. They'd invested heavily in preparing for American launch. Manufacturing facilities stood ready. Marketing campaigns were designed, sales representatives had been hired and trained. The company projected Kevadon would become one of the highest-grossing drugs in American pharmaceutical history, potentially reaching $100 million in annual sales. Kelsey began reading the application on September 12th. The document was substantial. Hundreds of pages of data, studies, testimonials, and safety information. Richardson Merrill had compiled everything from European experience, animal studies, clinical observations, prescription volumes, safety records. The package looked professionally assembled and comprehensive. But Kelsey noticed problems immediately. The chronic toxicity data seemed inadequate. Studies showing what happened with long-term thalidomide use were either missing or poorly documented. The application relied heavily on acute toxicity studies, giving animals large single doses and observing short-term effects. This showed the drug didn't kill quickly, but revealed nothing about extended exposure. She found the absorption and excretion data particularly weak. How did the body process thalidomide? How long did it remain in the system? What metabolites were produced? The application provided vague answers or none at all. For a drug intended for regular use, these gaps seemed significant. Kelsey drafted her first request for additional information on October 15th, exactly 1 month after receiving the application. She asked for better chronic toxicity studies, clearer metabolic data, and more detailed information about the drug's fate in the human body. The letter was polite but firm. Richardson Merrill responded with frustration. They provided some additional animal data, but emphasized that Kevadon had been used safely by millions in Europe. The European experience represented the largest safety study imaginable. What more proof did the FDA need? Kelsey remained unsatisfied. The animal studies they submitted still focused on rodents. She wanted to see studies on multiple species, particularly rabbits. Different animals metabolized drugs differently. Relying solely on mouse and rat data seemed insufficient for a medication intended for widespread human use. The company's next response grew more aggressive. Richardson Merrill representatives began calling Kelsey directly, pressing for approval. They arranged meetings with her supervisors, suggesting that excessive caution was delaying a beneficial medication. Their tone implied that a new FDA reviewer was being unnecessarily difficult, perhaps overcompensating to prove herself. November brought increased pressure. Richardson Merrill submitted revised data addressing some of Kelsey's concerns, but argued that European approval and extensive use should satisfy any remaining questions. They pointed out that Britain's regulatory system, comparable to America's in rigor, had thoroughly vetted thalidomide. Why should the FDA require different standards? Kelsey noticed something else troubling. The British Medical Journal had published Ralph Voss's letter about peripheral neuropathy linked to thalidomide. Richardson Merrill's application mentioned this issue only briefly, downplaying its significance. Kelsey found this omission concerning. Any drug causing nerve damage deserved careful scrutiny. She requested more information about the neuropathy reports. How common was this side effect? What was the mechanism? Did it resolve after discontinuation? The company responded that the nerve problems were minor, reversible, and rare. But Kelsey's pharmacology background made her suspicious. Peripheral neuropathy suggested the drug crossed into nervous system tissue, raising questions about what else it might penetrate. December arrived with Richardson Merrill executives growing openly hostile. They complained formally to FDA leadership about Kelsey's repeated delays. The company was losing money every day American approval remained blocked. European sales demonstrated clear safety and efficacy. The continued requests for additional data seemed arbitrary and obstructionist. FDA management backed Kelsey, but encouraged her to resolve the application quickly. The agency preferred approvals over rejections when possible. Kevadon appeared to be a legitimate medication, with substantial international validation. Perhaps she could approve it with appropriate labelling about the neuropathy risk. Kelsey refused. Her concern went beyond peripheral nerve damage. The application's fundamental weakness was inadequate understanding of thalidomide's behaviour in the human body. She wanted comprehensive studies showing absorption rates, distribution patterns, metabolism pathways, and excretion mechanisms. Without this information, approving any drug seemed premature. Richardson Merrill made a calculated decision in December 1960. They couldn't wait indefinitely for FDA approval, but they could exploit a regulatory loophole. The company distributed Kevadon as investigational samples to 1,200 American physicians. These doctors could provide the drug to patients as part of supposed clinical research, bypassing the need for formal approval. The distribution was massive and systematic. Richardson Merrill sent tablets to obstetricians, general practitioners, psychiatrists and internists across the country. They included promotional materials emphasizing European safety data. The physicians receiving samples were encouraged to prescribe Kevadon liberally and report their experiences. This created exactly the situation FDA approval was meant to prevent. Over 2.5 million tablets entered American medicine without formal regulatory clearance. Thousands of patients, including pregnant women, began taking thalidomide under the guise of clinical investigation. The company was effectively launching the drug through a legal technicality. Kelsey learned about the investigational distribution and was appalled, but her authority didn't extend to this practice. The regulations allowed investigational use with proper protocols. Richardson Merrill had technically followed the rules, even while violating their spirit. The FDA could do nothing except continue reviewing the formal application. January 1961 brought more pressure. Richardson Merrill provided additional studies addressing some of Kelsey's concerns. They conducted rabbit studies showing no acute toxicity. They submitted more detailed metabolic data. Each submission came with increasingly impatient language demanding approval. Kelsey found new problems with every submission. The rabbit studies used non-pregnant animals. She wanted teratology data, studies examining effects on developing fetuses. Richardson Merrill responded that such studies were unnecessary. The drug had been used by pregnant women throughout Europe without reported problems. This assertion was technically true in January 1961. The European medical establishment hadn't yet publicly acknowledged the birth defect crisis. Lenz's warnings remained largely dismissed. Grunenthal continued denying any connection between thalidomide and limb deformities. Richardson Merrill genuinely believed their statement about pregnancy safety reflected reality. But Kelsey's instincts screamed warnings. A drug causing peripheral neuropathy clearly crossed biological barriers. If it penetrated nerve tissue, might it cross the placenta? The absence of proper pregnancy studies seemed like a glaring omission, especially for a medication marketed toward women of childbearing age. February brought a breakthrough that vindicated Kelsey's caution. The British Medical Journal published an article by Dr. A. Leslie Florence, a colleague of Lenz's, discussing possible connections between thalidomide and birth defects. The evidence remained preliminary, but the suggestion was now in major medical literature. Kelsey seized on this publication. She sent another request to Richardson Merrill, demanding they address the birth defect concerns before any approval could proceed. The company's response was dismissive. One speculative article didn't constitute evidence. Grunenthal had investigated these claims and found them baseless. March and April saw the bureaucratic battle intensify. Richardson Merrill complained to congressmen about FDA obstruction. They suggested that Kelsey's inexperience and excessive caution were denying Americans access to a beneficial medication. Some politicians began questioning whether FDA standards had become unreasonably stringent. Kelsey absorbed the criticism and continued demanding better data. She wanted definitive teratology studies. She wanted comprehensive pregnancy exposure information. She wanted mechanisms of action fully elucidated. Her supervisors grew concerned that she was being too rigid, potentially creating precedents that would delay all new drug approvals. But Kelsey had pharmacological training that most FDA reviewers lacked. Her PhD research had involved studying how drugs affected biological systems. She understood that medications could have subtle mechanisms not revealed by crude animal studies. The thalidomide application showed too many gaps for someone with her scientific background to ignore. May 1961 marked 8 months since the application arrived. Richardson Merrill's frustration reached breaking point. They organised a meeting with senior FDA officials, bringing their own scientists and consultants. The company made their case forcefully. Thalidomide was safe, extensively tested, widely used internationally. The single stubborn reviewer blocking approval was damaging public health by denying access. FDA leadership asked Kelsey to attend and defend her position. She arrived with detailed notes outlining every deficiency in the application. Her presentation was methodical and scientific. She acknowledged the European experience but emphasized that extensive use didn't guarantee safety without proper mechanistic understanding. The meeting ended without resolution. FDA officials decided to support Kelsey's authority to request additional data. Richardson Merrill left furious. The company began considering whether to withdraw the application and resubmit later, hoping for a different reviewer. Meanwhile, the investigational distribution continued flooding American medicine with thalidomide. Doctors prescribed it freely, particularly in states with larger pharmaceutical industry presence. Pregnant women received Kevadon from their obstetricians. Insomniacs got prescriptions from family doctors. Anxious patients tried it for stress relief. The timing was catastrophically fortunate. Most investigational distribution occurred in late 1960 and early 1961. Women taking Kevadon during those months would deliver babies in mid to late 1961, exactly when the European disaster was about to explode into public consciousness. Kelsey's obstinate refusal to approve the drug, spanning from September 1960 through mid-1961, prevented official American distribution during the most dangerous period. Her bureaucratic stubbornness, mocked and criticized by Richardson Merrill and questioned by colleagues, was literally saving thousands of unborn American children from limb destruction. She didn't know this yet. Neither did anyone else in America. The European pattern hadn't reached American consciousness. Lenz's warnings remained largely confined to German medical circles. McBride's Australian concerns were similarly localised. The international medical community hadn't connected the dots. But across the Atlantic, the evidence was becoming impossible to suppress. German hospitals were recording birth defects at rates hundreds of times normal. British maternity wards reported similar spikes. Australian obstetricians documented the same terrifying pattern. Paediatricians in every country where thalidomide was sold were seeing limb deformities that shouldn't exist. Widukind Lenz had compiled data from over 50 affected births by May 1961. His documentation was meticulous and damning. The correlation between maternal Contagan use during gestational days 35-50 and severe limb deformities was statistically overwhelming. No reasonable scientist examining his data could dismiss it as coincidence. William McBride had similar evidence from Australia. His case series now included dozens of babies born with phocomelia, nearly all whose mothers had taken Distaval during early pregnancy. He'd contacted British authorities with his findings, adding weight to Lenz's German reports. The pharmaceutical companies were running out of ways to deny the pattern. Grunenthal's tactics shifted from outright dismissal to demanding impossible proof standards. They argued that only controlled studies could establish causation. Retrospective case series, no matter how compelling, couldn't meet scientific standards for definitive evidence. This argument was technically correct and morally bankrupt. Conducting controlled studies would require deliberately exposing pregnant women to thalidomide to see if their babies were born deformed. Such research would be grotesquely unethical. The companies were demanding proof that could only come from experiments no researcher could justifiably conduct. Lentz decided to force the issue. He had enough data to publish findings that would be impossible to ignore. He prepared a comprehensive paper documenting the correlation, including detailed case reports, statistical analysis, and temporal patterns showing the drug's effects matched specific developmental windows. But publication took time. Medical journals required peer review, papers needed editing. The process involved months of delay. Meanwhile, Contagon remained on pharmacy shelves. Pregnant women continued taking it. More babies were being damaged every day the drug stayed available. Lenz faced an ethical dilemma. Should he wait for proper publication through scientific channels, or should he go public immediately despite lacking formal peer review? Publishing prematurely could damage his credibility, but waiting meant more deformed babies. In Washington, Frances Kelsey continued her bureaucratic resistance, unaware that she was the thin barrier between American medicine and catastrophe. Her stubbornness, her insistence on proper data, her refusal to be bullied by corporate pressure, these qualities made her unpopular with pharmaceutical companies, but were protecting an entire generation of American children. The collision was coming. Europe's disaster would soon explode into global consciousness. When it did, Frances Kelsey would transform from obstinate bureaucrat to national hero. Richardson Merrill would face humiliation. Grunenthal would face criminal charges, but none of them knew this yet. In May 1961, thalidomide still seemed like a successful drug facing a few scattered questions from overly cautious doctors. The full horror remained hidden behind hospital walls, whispered about in maternity wards, denied by companies with billions at stake. The revelation was weeks away. November 1961. Widukind Lenz sat in his Hamburg office surrounded by case files that represented the end of thalidomide's reign. He documented 83 births now, each folder containing photographs that would haunt anyone who saw them. Babies without arms, children born with flippers, infants missing all 4 limbs, their torsos ending in smooth stumps. The statistical correlation was mathematically undeniable. Of the 83 severely deformed babies, 79 mothers had taken Contagon during gestational days 35 to 50. The 4 exceptions likely involved unreported use or memory failures during traumatic interviews. The probability of this pattern occurring by chance was essentially zero. Lenz had cross-referenced his data with pharmacy records, prescription histories, and delivery dates. The temporal relationship was precise and brutal. Take Contagon on day 37 of pregnancy. Arms didn't develop. Day 42, legs suffered. Day 35 through 50. Catastrophic damage across multiple limb structures outside that window. Usually normal development. He had also solved the mechanism. Thalidomide interfered with angiogenesis, new blood vessel formation. Developing limbs required rapid vascular growth to supply nutrients and oxygen. The drug essentially starved embryonic limb buds at their most vulnerable moment. Without adequate blood flow, cells died. Bones never formed. Muscles couldn't develop. The result was phocomelia, amelia, and variations between. The pharmaceutical industry's animal studies had missed this because rodent embryonic development followed different timelines and mechanisms than human gestation. Rats metabolized thalidomide differently. Mice had shorter pregnancy windows. The species difference meant animal studies showed full safety, while human fetuses were being destroyed. Lenz now understood something horrifying. The deformities weren't random disasters. They were precisely calibrated injuries reflecting exact timing of drug exposure. Each affected baby carried a biological timestamp showing when their mother swallowed Contagon. The drug's effects were so specific that Lentz could estimate conception date by observing which limbs were damaged. This scientific precision made the tragedy worse somehow. The deformities weren't genetic bad luck or mysterious environmental toxins. They were pharmaceutical injuries, preventable and entirely human-caused. Corporate negligence had created these children. Inadequate testing had allowed it. Aggressive marketing had amplified it. Lentz spent the first 2 weeks of November assembling his case for final confrontation. He compiled photographs, medical records, statistical analyses, prescription timelines, and mechanism studies into an irrefutable package. Grunenthal had dodged and denied for a year. That was ending. November 15, 1961, Lentz travelled to Stolberg with his documentation. He demanded a meeting with Grunenthal's senior executives. Company management, recognizing the seriousness, assembled their medical director, legal counsel, and research leadership. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Lentz presented his evidence methodically. 83 cases, statistical analysis showing impossible coincidence, mechanism studies explaining how thalidomide attacked developing limbs, temporal patterns matching precise gestational windows, pharmacy records confirming maternal Contagon use. The data was comprehensive and damning. Grunenthal's response combined shock, denial, and calculation. The executives hadn't fully grasped the scale until Lentz laid out complete documentation. Some appeared genuinely horrified. Others immediately focused on legal and financial implications. Company lawyers began drafting strategies to minimize liability. But the scientific evidence was overwhelming even to corporate executives with no medical training. The correlation was too strong, the mechanism too clear, the pattern too consistent. Grunenthal couldn't maintain public denial without appearing willfully blind or criminally negligent. The company requested time to conduct internal review. Lentz refused. Every day's delay meant more pregnant women taking Contagon, more fetuses being damaged. He gave them 48 hours to withdraw the drug voluntarily. Otherwise, he would go directly to press and regulatory authorities with his findings. Grunenthal's management faced their nightmare scenario. Voluntary withdrawal would be seen as admission of guilt, opening them to massive lawsuits. But refusing withdrawal while evidence circulated would appear monstrous. The company was trapped between financial catastrophe and moral catastrophe. They chose financial damage over public condemnation. Grunenthal's lawyers began preparing withdrawal strategies while executives calculated potential liability. The company had earned hundreds of millions from Contagon. Compensation claims could bankrupt them entirely. November 26, 1961, the Welt am Sonntag, a major German newspaper, published the first public warning. The article was careful, legally vetted, but devastating. It reported that medical evidence suggested Contagon might cause severe birth defects. Several prominent doctors confirmed they'd observed unusual patterns of limb deformities among babies whose mothers took the drug during pregnancy. The story cited no specific numbers yet, avoiding litigation risk. But the implication was clear enough to terrify any pregnant woman who'd taken Contagon. German pharmacies received panicked calls within hours. Doctors' offices were flooded with anxious mothers demanding information. November 27, barely 24 hours after the newspaper article, Grunenthal issued a statement withdrawing Contagon from the German market. The announcement cited an abundance of caution regarding possible connections to birth defects. The phrasing was legalistic, avoiding clear admission while acknowledging concerns. German pharmacies pulled Contagon immediately. Doctors stopped prescribing it. The drug that had dominated German sedative sales for 4 years vanished from shelves within 48 hours. But the withdrawal came far too late for thousands of developing fetuses already exposed. News spread internationally with terrifying speed. November 28th, British newspapers picked up the story. The Daily Mail ran a front-page article about the German withdrawal. British medical authorities contacted Distillers Company demanding explanation. December 1st, Distillers pulled Distaval from the UK market. Australia withdrew thalidomide on December 2nd. Canada followed on December 3rd. Sweden, Portugal, Japan, every country where the drug was sold initiated emergency withdrawals. The cascade took less than a week. A medication prescribed in 46 countries disappeared globally in days. Richardson Merrill in America immediately halted their investigational distribution. The company sent urgent telegrams to the 1-200 physicians who'd received Kevadon samples, demanding they stop prescribing immediately and return all unused tablets. The FDA's pending application was withdrawn without explanation. Frances Kelsey suddenly found herself vindicated in the most horrible way possible. Her 19 months of stubborn resistance had prevented official American approval during the exact period when thalidomide was destroying thousands of European babies. The investigational samples had created only limited American exposure compared to what full approval would have caused. But the European toll was catastrophic beyond initial estimates. December brought the first wave of affected births from women who'd taken thalidomide during late September and early October. Hospitals across Germany recorded multiple phocomelia cases daily. British maternity wards reported similar surges. The numbers climbed with sickening momentum. December saw over 200 affected births in Germany alone. January 1962 brought more than 300. February peaked at nearly 400 in a single month. The curve reflected peak Contagon prescribing during mid-1961, those pregnancies now reaching term. Each affected baby represented a family destroyed, parents confronted with armless children, mothers who trusted their doctors facing infants with flippers instead of hands, fathers looking at babies without legs, knowing their wives had been told Contagon was safer than sugar. The deformities varied in severity but shared common features. Phocomelia, seal-like flippers, was most characteristic. Some babies had short bones connecting torso to tiny hands, creating flipper appearance. Others had longer bones but missing segments, with feet or hands attached directly to shoulders or hips. Complete amelia cases lacked limbs entirely. These children were born with torso and head but no arms or legs whatsoever. Their survival depended on complete lifetime care. They would never walk, never pick up objects, never perform basic human activities without assistance. Many affected babies also suffered ear abnormalities. External ears were frequently missing or severely malformed. Some children were born completely deaf. Others had internal hearing structures but no visible ears, creating bizarre appearance of smooth skull sides. Internal organs sometimes developed abnormally. Heart defects occurred in subset of cases. Kidney malformations appeared. Intestinal problems affected some infants. The drug's anti-angiogenic effects weren't limited to limbs. Any developing tissue requiring rapid blood vessel growth was vulnerable. Approximately 40% of affected babies died within their first year. The combination of multiple severe deformities, organ problems, and complications from abnormal development proved fatal. Many died within days or weeks of birth. Families watched their children struggle and fail, carrying grief compounded by knowledge that pharmaceutical negligence had caused it all. The survivors faced lifetimes of disability, surgeries, prosthetics, and social stigma. Children with flipper arms needed multiple operations attempting to improve function, Those without limbs required extensive physical therapy learning to use prosthetic devices. Many would never achieve independence. Germany's count reached 5,000 affected births by mid-1962. The number represented only documented cases. Many families never reported or weren't properly recorded. Actual German toll likely exceeded 6,000 children. Britain documented over 2,000 cases. The British count was more accurate due to National Health Service's comprehensive record keeping. Every affected birth was tracked, documented, and included in official registries. The true horror was undeniable. Australia recorded approximately 100 cases. The country's smaller population and more limited thalidomide distribution resulted in fewer absolute numbers, but similar proportional devastation. William McBride's early warnings had been ignored just long enough to destroy 100 Australian families. Japan's pharmaceutical companies had marketed thalidomide aggressively. Over 1,000 Japanese babies were born with thalidomide-induced deformities. Some estimates suggested the actual number was higher, with cases in rural areas going unreported or misclassified. Canada saw roughly 100 documented cases. Sweden recorded about 150. Across Europe and beyond, every country where thalidomide had been sold added to the toll. Portugal, Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, Italy, Spain. The casualty list was international. Final global estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 affected children. The uncertainty reflected incomplete record keeping, varying diagnostic standards, and families who never sought medical documentation. Conservative counts settled around 10,000 confirmed cases, with potentially twice that many total injuries. America's toll was 17 confirmed cases, 17 babies born with thalidomide-induced deformities from Richardson Merrill's investigational distribution, 17 families destroyed by samples that should never have been distributed, but 17 instead of potentially thousands. Frances Kelsey had prevented a massacre. Her refusal to approve Kevadon despite enormous pressure had saved an entire generation of American children from destruction. The babies born healthy in 1961 and 1962 owed their normal limbs to one stubborn FDA reviewer who wouldn't be bullied. The American press discovered her story in February 1962. The Washington Post ran a front-page article, "Heroine of FDA keeps bad drug off market." Other newspapers picked up the narrative. Kelsey became an overnight national hero, the bureaucrat who'd stood against corporate power and won. President John F. Kennedy awarded her the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service in August 1962. The ceremony celebrated her courage and scientific integrity. She received standing ovations. Newspaper editorials praised her vindication of careful government regulation against corporate impatience. But Kelsey herself felt no triumph. She'd prevented American catastrophe while European children suffered. Her victory was built on other countries' tragedies. The timing was pure fortune. Her stubbornness happened to coincide with thalidomide's most destructive period. Had Richardson Merrill submitted their application a year earlier, even Kelsey might have approved it before evidence emerged. Across Europe, hospitals overflowed with affected newborns through spring 1962. The wave of births from peak thalidomide exposure continued into April and May. Maternity wards that normally saw one birth defect monthly were recording 5, 10, 15 phocomelia cases. Medical staff suffered psychological trauma from the continuous horror. Midwives who delivered babies for decades had never seen anything comparable. Pediatricians trained to handle rare complications faced daily emergencies beyond their preparation. The medical establishment was overwhelmed. Parents formed support groups trying to cope with shock and grief. Families with affected children met in hospitals, sharing information and emotional support. Many marriages dissolved under the strain. Some parents institutionalized their children immediately, unable to face the lifetime burden. Others dedicated themselves to maximizing their child's quality of life despite profound disabilities. Media coverage was extensive and gruesome. Newspapers published photographs of affected babies, shocking the public. Television news ran stories showing children with flipper limbs. The images were intentionally disturbing, designed to generate outrage against the pharmaceutical industry. Public anger targeted Grunenthal primarily, but extended to distillers, Richardson Merrill, and every company that had marketed thalidomide. Protesters demonstrated outside corporate headquarters. Politicians demanded investigations. Regulatory agencies faced criticism for approving the drug initially. The pharmaceutical industry entered crisis mode. Every company selling medications suddenly faced enhanced scrutiny. Doctors questioned everything they prescribed. Patients demanded to know about drug testing procedures. The comfortable assumptions about pharmaceutical safety and regulatory oversight were shattered. Thalidomide had revealed that the system protecting public health was inadequate. Companies could rush inadequately tested drugs to market. Regulators could approve medications without thorough evaluation. The profit motive could override scientific caution, and thousands of babies could pay the price. The catastrophe was complete. A drug synthesized from failed pesticide research, tested minimally on rodents, marketed aggressively to pregnant women, had created the worst pharmaceutical disaster in history. Over 10,000 children born without limbs, thousands dead within their first year, thousands more facing lifetimes of disability. And it was all preventable. Proper pregnancy studies would have revealed the danger. Adequate testing on multiple animal species might have shown teratogenic effects. Simple caution about prescribing any drug to pregnant women could have minimized exposure. But speed and profit had won over safety. Now came the reckoning. May 1968, Alsdorf Courthouse near Aachen, Germany. 9 Grunenthal executives sat in the defendant's dock facing criminal charges that would define pharmaceutical accountability for decades. The charges included negligent homicide, causing bodily harm through negligence, and violating drug safety regulations. If convicted, they faced substantial prison sentences. The trial was Germany's largest pharmaceutical prosecution ever attempted. Lead prosecutor Gerd Schutter had spent 3 years building the case, assembling evidence from thousands of medical records, internal company documents, and testimony from affected families. His core argument was simple. Grunenthal knew, or should have known, thalidomide was dangerous and sold it anyway. The defense team was equally formidable. Grunenthal had hired Germany's most expensive corporate lawyers, who arrived with a strategy refined through 6 years of preparation. Their position: the company acted according to 1950s scientific standards, conducted appropriate testing for that era, and couldn't have predicted catastrophic effects that even sophisticated researchers failed to anticipate. The trial's first week established the human toll. Prosecutors presented photographs of severely disabled children, now aged 7 to 9 years old. Some had learned to write holding pencils in their mouths. Others used prosthetic arms with limited success. Many remained completely dependent on caregivers for every basic function. Parents testified about destroyed lives. A mother described watching her armless daughter try to feed herself, unable to perform tasks most people never consciously thought about. A father explained the financial burden of constant medical care, specialized equipment, and endless surgeries attempting to improve function. The testimonies were devastating and legally irrelevant to the criminal charges. Grunenthal's lawyers objected repeatedly to emotional testimony. The trial concerned whether executives knowingly violated regulations, not how tragic the outcomes were. The judge allowed limited victim testimony, but kept focus on corporate decision-making processes and scientific knowledge available during the 1950s. Week 2 brought internal Grunenthal documents into evidence. These papers revealed the company's actual knowledge and decision-making timeline. A December 1959 internal memo showed research director Heinrich Muchter had been informed about unusual birth defects potentially linked to Contagon. His response: continue monitoring but maintain sales. Another document from February 1961 documented a meeting where executives discussed Widukind-Lentz's emerging evidence. Rather than investigating thoroughly, management decided to aggressively market Contagon more intensively before any potential withdrawal became necessary. The strategy was explicitly profit-driven: maximize revenue while the drug remained available. Prosecutors introduced correspondence showing Grunenthal threatened legal action against doctors raising safety concerns. The company had sent intimidating letters to multiple physicians, warning that unfounded accusations constituted defamation. These tactics delayed public awareness by months while Contagon sales continued. The defense countered by contextualizing 1950s pharmaceutical practices. Drug testing protocols were genuinely less rigorous then. Regulatory requirements were minimal. Teratology as a scientific discipline barely existed. No company routinely tested medications on pregnant animals because the field hadn't established such standards. Defense lawyers produced their own expert witnesses arguing that Grunenthal's testing met contemporary expectations. Other pharmaceutical companies were conducting similarly limited studies. The industry standard was inadequate by modern measures, but Grunenthal hadn't fallen below that standard. They'd simply followed normal practices that proved catastrophically insufficient. This argument was legally powerful and morally hollow. Yes, industry-wide practices were inadequate, but Grunenthal had also actively suppressed emerging evidence, threatened doctors, and prioritized profits over investigation. The question wasn't just what they knew initially, but how they responded when warnings emerged. Week 3 focused on the peripheral neuropathy reports from 1959-1960. Prosecutors demonstrated that Grunenthal knew Contagon caused nerve damage well before birth defects became apparent. This established that the drug crossed into nervous tissue, raising obvious questions about other potential impacts including fetal effects. Internal documents showed company scientists discussing whether to fund pregnancy studies after the neuropathy reports emerged. The studies would have cost approximately 50,000 marks and required 6 months. Management rejected this proposal as unnecessary expense that might delay sales. This decision, prosecutors argued, was criminally negligent. Defense attorneys challenged the causal chain. Even if Grunenthal had conducted pregnancy studies in 1960, would they have detected the problem? Rat studies might have missed species-specific effects. The narrow window of vulnerability meant studies required precise timing. Even well-intentioned research might have failed to reveal the danger. The trial became a philosophical debate about corporate responsibility and scientific uncertainty. How much testing was enough? When did cost-benefit analysis become criminal negligence? At what point did profit-seeking cross into actionable wrongdoing? These questions had no clear legal answers. Months dragged into years. The trial proceedings lasted 2.5 years, with over 280 court sessions. Witnesses included pharmaceutical executives, research scientists, regulatory officials, medical professionals, and affected families. The transcript eventually exceeded 15,000 pages. Media coverage was intense initially but faded as the trial became repetitive and technical. Public attention moved to other scandals. The daily grind of legal proceedings lacked the dramatic impact of initial revelations. Most Germans stopped following the case closely after the first year. Meanwhile, affected families needed money immediately, not justice years later. Medical expenses accumulated relentlessly. Children required surgeries, prosthetics, physical therapy, specialized education, constant care. Many families faced bankruptcy from disability-related costs. Grunenthal recognized this pressure and exploited it strategically. Company lawyers approached families privately offering immediate settlements in exchange for dropping civil claims. The amounts were substantial enough to help, but far below what full compensation would require. Desperate families accepted. Each settlement included strict confidentiality agreements. Recipients couldn't discuss terms or criticize Grunenthal publicly. This silenced many potential witnesses and reduced public pressure on the company. The strategy was cynical but effective. Buy silence from those most harmed. By 1970, over 3,000 German families had accepted settlements, rather than wait for trial resolution. Grunenthal paid out approximately 100 million marks through these private agreements while the criminal trial continued. The company was essentially settling around the legal proceedings rather than through them. Prosecutors faced an impossible situation. The trial was costing millions, taking years, and might ultimately fail due to legal technicalities about 1950s scientific standards. Meanwhile, Grunenthal was negotiating with victims individually, fragmenting potential collective action. December 1970, the prosecution and defense reached a compromise that enraged everyone. Criminal charges would be dropped in exchange for Grunenthal establishing a 100 million mark compensation fund for German victims. The company would never admit legal guilt or accept criminal liability. The trial would end without verdict. The arrangement satisfied no one fully but seemed pragmatically necessary. Continuing the trial for potentially several more years might result in acquittals on technical grounds, leaving victims with nothing. The fund at least provided immediate resources. The compromise was practical and unsatisfying. Families felt betrayed. After years hoping for justice and accountability, the system delivered money without admission of wrongdoing. Grunenthal executives walked free, never convicted, never imprisoned, never officially held responsible. The pharmaceutical industry learned that even catastrophic negligence might avoid criminal punishment. British legal battles followed a similar trajectory. Distillers Company faced over 400 lawsuits from British families. The company's initial response was aggressive denial, followed by grudging minimal settlement offers. British courts moved slowly, and distillers exploited every delay tactic available. The Sunday Times launched an investigative journalism campaign in 1972 that transformed British awareness. Reporter Philip Knightley obtained internal distillers' documents showing the company knew about Lenz's warnings before pulling Distaval from market. The evidence suggested distillers had delayed withdrawal by weeks, during which additional British women took the drug. Public outrage forced government intervention. British politicians couldn't ignore newspaper exposés showing corporate callousness. Parliament established a compensation scheme pressuring distillers to contribute substantially. The company eventually paid approximately $20 million into a trust fund for British victims, though without admitting liability. Compensation varied wildly across countries based on legal systems and political pressure. German victims received relatively consistent amounts through the Grunenthal Fund. British survivors got payments from the government-pressured trust. Canadian families received provincial support varying by region. Australian compensation was particularly complex. William McBride had documented the disaster early, but Australian authorities were slow to establish support systems. Some families received substantial settlements, others got minimal assistance. The inconsistency reflected Australia's federated system, where different states handled disability support differently. Japanese victims faced cultural barriers to pursuing compensation. Social stigma around disability was intense in 1960s Japan. Many families hid affected children rather than seek public support. Those who pursued claims often faced lengthy legal battles against Japanese pharmaceutical companies that had licensed thalidomide. American families with the 17 confirmed cases had the most difficult situation. Richardson Merrill had never officially marketed Kevadon, only distributed investigational samples. The company argued this limited their liability since the drug lacked formal approval. Families pursued litigation but faced high legal barriers. Some countries provided essentially no compensation. Developing nations where thalidomide had been sold lacked resources or legal frameworks to support disabled citizens. Families in these countries received nothing beyond whatever local charity or family support systems could provide. The survivors themselves experienced vastly different life trajectories based on deformity, severity, and family resources. Children born without arms could sometimes adapt with prosthetics and training, achieving reasonable independence. Those missing all 4 limbs remained dependent on caregivers throughout their lives. Mortality rates among survivors remained elevated through childhood and adolescence. Complications from multiple disabilities, infections, surgical complications, and organ problems killed many victims before adulthood. Approximately 40% of affected babies died within their first year, and additional deaths occurred throughout the following decades. Those reaching adulthood in the 1980s faced a world unprepared for their needs. Accessibility standards barely existed. Buildings lacked ramps and elevators. Public transportation was inaccessible. Employment discrimination was legal. Educational systems struggled to accommodate profound disabilities. Many survivors achieved remarkable resilience. Some learned to write with prosthetic arms or feet. Others developed careers using adaptive technology. A few became disability rights advocates, turning their experiences into activism. But these successes required extraordinary effort and family support that many lacked. The psychological toll was equally severe. Growing up visibly different created intense social stigma. Bullying was common. Romantic relationships were difficult. Constant medical interventions created trauma. Depression and suicide rates among thalidomide survivors exceeded general population levels significantly. Families experienced their own lasting damage. Marriages dissolved under the strain of caring for profoundly disabled children. Siblings often received inadequate attention. Parents faced financial ruin from medical expenses. The catastrophe radiated outward from each affected child, destroying family structures around them. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical regulation was being completely rebuilt. The thalidomide disaster exposed how inadequate existing systems were. Every developed country overhauled drug approval processes in response. The changes represented the industry's most significant regulatory transformation since governments began overseeing medicines. The United States implemented the Kefauver-Harris Amendments in 1962, massively expanding FDA authority. New drugs now required proof of efficacy, not just safety. Clinical trials became mandatory with structured phases. Informed consent protocols were established. Pregnancy testing became standard for any medication potentially used by women of childbearing age. European countries created new regulatory agencies with expanded powers. Germany established the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices, with authority to demand extensive testing before approval. Britain strengthened the Committee on Safety of Medicines. International coordination improved, with countries sharing safety data. Pharmaceutical companies adapted by investing heavily in research and development. Clinical trials became multi-year processes involving thousands of participants. teratology studies on multiple animal species became standard. Companies hired toxicologists, reproductive specialists, and safety experts. Drug development timelines extended from months to years or even decades. The costs of bringing drugs to market increased exponentially. In the 1950s, a company might spend under $1 million developing and testing a new medication. By the 1980s, costs exceeded $100 million. By 2000, the figure reached billions. Thalidomide had made pharmaceutical development extremely expensive, but also much safer. Yet the fundamental tension remained unresolved. Pharmaceutical companies were profit-seeking corporations operating in competitive markets. Safety requirements conflicted with financial incentives to rush products to market. Regulatory agencies were perpetually understaffed and underfunded compared to the industries they oversaw. Thalidomide became the cautionary tale taught in every medical school and pharmacy program. Students learned about corporate negligence, inadequate testing, and regulatory failure. The case represented everything that could go wrong when profit motives overwhelmed scientific caution. But whether the lessons truly changed industry behavior remained uncertain. Some argued that modern regulation prevented disasters like thalidomide from recurring. The extensive testing requirements, multiple approval stages, and post-market surveillance made such catastrophic failures nearly impossible. The system had learned and improved. Others pointed out that pharmaceutical disasters continued occurring. Deaths caused cancer in daughters of women prescribed the drug during pregnancy. Vioxx killed tens of thousands through heart attacks before withdrawal. The opioid epidemic showed that pharmaceutical companies still prioritized profits over public health when possible. Thalidomide wasn't an aberration, but an especially visible example of systemic problems. The survivors themselves aged into their 40s and 50s during the 1990s and 2000s, facing new challenges. Bodies designed abnormally wore out faster than normal anatomy. Prosthetics needed constant replacement. Spinal problems emerged from using limbs in unnatural ways. Pain intensified. Many required additional surgeries decades after birth. Grunenthal never apologized until 2012, 50 years after the disaster, long after most executives involved had died. The company issued a carefully worded statement expressing regret without accepting legal liability. The apology was widely viewed as hollow and inadequate. The tragedy's final accounting was impossible to complete. Over 10,000 confirmed cases, thousands dead, thousands more living with severe disabilities, countless families destroyed, an entire generation of pharmaceutical oversight rebuilt, medical education transformed, but accountability remained elusive. 9 executives had faced criminal charges. None were convicted. No one went to prison. Companies paid compensation without admitting wrongdoing. The system had responded but hadn't delivered justice. The catastrophe had caused massive changes in regulation, but the people responsible walked away. Thalidomide stood as a permanent reminder that good intentions and technological progress were insufficient protections against human negligence and corporate greed. The disaster had required multiple failures occurring simultaneously: inadequate testing, aggressive marketing, regulatory weakness, corporate dishonesty, and medical overconfidence. Remove any one element and the tragedy might have been prevented. But all those elements had aligned perfectly to create history's worst pharmaceutical disaster. And the question haunting everyone was simple: could it happen again? 1965. Thalidomide had become synonymous with pharmaceutical evil. The name itself invoked horror. Medical textbooks featured it as the ultimate cautionary tale. Pharmacy students learned about it the way theology students learned about original sin, the foundational mistake from which all modern safeguards emerged. Parents used thalidomide as a threat metaphor for any dangerous medication. Doctors mentioned it when explaining why pregnancy drug restrictions existed. Regulatory agencies cited it when defending lengthy approval processes. The drug was culturally dead, scientifically condemned, socially toxic beyond redemption. Grunenthal's remaining thalidomide inventory was destroyed. Manufacturing equipment was dismantled. Chemical synthesis protocols were archived in sealed files. No pharmaceutical company would touch any molecule even remotely similar. The drug structure became a warning symbol in chemistry journals. Here be dragons. Yet thalidomide itself remained chemically stable and medically interesting. The molecule hadn't changed. Its properties persisted regardless of human opinion. And those properties included something researchers were beginning to notice. It inhibited blood vessel formation dramatically. The same mechanism that destroyed embryonic limb development could theoretically fight cancer. Tumours required rapid angiogenesis to grow beyond tiny sizes. Without new blood vessels supplying nutrients, cancers starved. Thalidomide's anti-angiogenic effects might kill tumours while leaving established tissues unharmed. This possibility remained theoretical through the 1960s and 1970s. No researcher dared suggest using thalidomide therapeutically. Career suicide would follow any such proposal. The drug was morally contaminated beyond scientific redemption. Even mentioning it, except as cautionary example, invited professional ostracism. But science operates through mechanisms, not morality. The chemical facts remained indifferent to human tragedy. Thalidomide blocked VEGF pathways and inhibited TNF-alpha production. These properties had medical value regardless of the drug's history. Some researchers quietly wondered whether condemning a potentially useful molecule forever made sense. 1991 brought the breakthrough that changed everything. Dr. Gilla Kaplan at Rockefeller University published research showing thalidomide suppressed TNF-alpha production in leprosy patients. The drug reduced painful inflammatory complications dramatically. Patients with erythema nodosum leprosum, a devastating immune reaction, responded to thalidomide when nothing else worked. The research was methodologically sound and medically significant. Leprosy patients suffered intensely from ENL reactions. Existing treatments were inadequate. Thalidomide offered genuine relief. But how could anyone seriously propose using the century's most notorious drug therapeutically? Kaplan's paper addressed this directly. She acknowledged the history, but argued that science shouldn't abandon effective treatments because of past misuse. With proper safeguards, thalidomide could help people suffering from conditions that had no alternatives. The key was preventing pregnancy exposure absolutely. Other researchers began investigating thalidomide's anti-cancer properties more openly. Multiple myeloma studies showed remarkable effectiveness. The drug attacked cancer through several mechanisms simultaneously, inhibiting blood vessel growth, modulating immune responses, inducing cancer cell death directly. Response rates exceeded existing chemotherapy options. Clinical trials expanded through the 1990s. Multiple myeloma patients with few alternatives volunteered for studies. The results were striking. Thalidomide extended survival meaningfully. Some patients experienced complete remission. The drug that had destroyed developing limbs was saving adult lives. But every research paper included extensive safety discussions. The teratogenic effects were permanent and unforgivable. Any therapeutic use required absolute pregnancy prevention. Male patients needed contraception too, since thalidomide appeared in semen. The safety protocols would need to be revolutionary. July 16, 1998, the FDA approved thalidomide for ENL treatment in leprosy patients. The decision was controversial, unprecedented, and carefully structured. Approval came with the most restrictive safety program ever imposed on any medication. The System for Thalidomide Education and Prescribing Safety, STEPS, created barriers unprecedented in pharmaceutical regulation. Under STEPS, patients couldn't simply receive prescriptions. They had to register in a national database. Doctors needed special certification requiring training about teratogenic risks. Pharmacists had to verify patient registration before dispensing. The drug came with mandatory educational materials, consent forms, and regular surveys. Women of childbearing potential faced the strictest requirements. Mandatory pregnancy testing before starting treatment. Monthly pregnancy tests while taking the drug. Required use of 2 forms of contraception simultaneously. Consent forms explicitly describing birth defect risks with graphic detail. Male patients also faced contraception requirements, even though mechanisms of harm through semen were less certain. Better to over-restrict than risk any possibility of fetal exposure. The safety protocols assumed that any pregnancy exposure would produce catastrophic outcomes. The approval faced immediate backlash. Disability rights advocates protested that allowing thalidomide's return insulted survivors. Some argued that no therapeutic benefit justified resurrecting such a toxic drug. The FDA was enabling pharmaceutical companies to profit from the molecule that had caused history's worst drug disaster. But leprosy patients and multiple myeloma sufferers told different stories. They described suffering that thalidomide relieved when nothing else worked. They wanted access despite the risks because their alternatives were death or unbearable pain. The debate pitted survivor trauma against patient autonomy. 2006 brought FDA approval for multiple myeloma treatment. The same STEPS protocols applied, now renamed REMS, Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. Thalidomide's safety program became the model for managing high-risk medications. Other dangerous but effective drugs adopted similar frameworks. In developed countries with robust healthcare systems and regulatory enforcement, the safety protocols worked remarkably well. The United States reported 0 thalidomide-induced birth defects in the decade following approval. Pregnancy testing requirements caught exposures before significant damage occurred. The 2 contraception rule prevented conception. Database tracking identified any protocol violations immediately. Europe approved thalidomide under similar restrictions. Japan authorized it with extensive safety requirements. Wealthy nations demonstrated that thalidomide could be used therapeutically without reproducing the 1960s catastrophe. The key was resources, enforcement, education, and absolute commitment to pregnancy prevention. But developing countries told a different story. Brazil approved thalidomide for leprosy treatment in the 1960s and never fully withdrew it. The drug remained available through government health programs treating Hansen's disease patients. Safety protocols existed on paper, but enforcement was inconsistent in remote regions. Brazilian clinics serving poor populations lacked resources for rigorous safety monitoring. Monthly pregnancy testing required laboratory access many communities didn't have. Contraception education faced cultural and religious barriers. Database tracking was impossible in areas without reliable computer systems or internet connectivity. The predictable happened. Women took thalidomide without understanding risks. Others knew the warnings but lacked access to reliable contraception. Some pharmacies dispensed the drug without proper verification. Rural areas with limited medical infrastructure couldn't maintain the safety protocols that worked in wealthy countries. 2005 brought the first reports of new thalidomide-induced birth defects in Brazil. A baby was born in Recife with characteristic phocomelia. Investigation revealed the mother had received thalidomide from a government health clinic for leprosy-related complications. She'd been told about risks but hadn't received adequate support for contraception. More cases emerged. By 2007, Brazilian health authorities documented over 30 new thalidomide babies. By 2010, the count exceeded 50. By 2015, more than 100 Brazilian children had been born with thalidomide-induced deformities, decades after the drug's dangers were supposedly understood and managed. The new victims were concentrated in Brazil's poorest regions. Northeast states with limited healthcare infrastructure and high leprosy rates produced most cases. The pattern was grimly predictable. Inadequate resources plus dangerous drug equals preventable tragedy. Brazilian survivors from the 1960s watched in horror as history repeated. They'd lived their entire lives as living warnings about thalidomide's dangers. Now they saw new children born with the same deformities they'd struggled with for 50 years. The nightmare wasn't over. It was regenerating in poverty and neglect. International health organizations investigated and found systematic failures. Doctors prescribing thalidomide without adequate training. Pharmacies dispensing it without pregnancy tests. Patients receiving insufficient contraception support. The safety protocols that worked in wealthy countries were failing catastrophically where resources were limited. Brazil faced an impossible dilemma. Thalidomide effectively treated complications of leprosy and certain cancers. Alternative medications were more expensive or less effective. Removing access would harm patients genuinely benefiting from the drug. But continuing availability meant accepting preventable birth defects in populations lacking resources for proper safeguards. The Brazilian government attempted stronger regulations. New rules required more extensive documentation, mandatory counselling, stricter pharmacy controls. But enforcement remained inconsistent. In remote areas serving impoverished populations, the gap between policy and reality stayed wide. Other developing countries faced similar challenges. India approved thalidomide for leprosy treatment with safety protocols modelled on American REMS. Implementation was spotty. Rural areas lacked infrastructure for rigorous monitoring. Cultural factors complicated contraception education. Cases of new thalidomide-induced birth defects appeared sporadically. The pattern revealed an uncomfortable truth. Thalidomide could be used safely only where healthcare systems were sufficiently advanced and resourced. The drug's therapeutic value was real, but accessing it safely required institutional capabilities that much of the world lacked. The 1960s disaster was being reproduced in slow motion wherever poverty met inadequate regulation. Original survivors watched these developments with complex emotions. Some advocated for complete global ban regardless of therapeutic benefits. The drug's history was too toxic, the risks too severe. No medical benefit justified accepting any possibility of new victims. Others recognized that banning thalidomide meant denying treatment to suffering patients who had no alternatives. The drug genuinely helped people with leprosy complications and certain cancers. Removing access punished patients for regulatory failures and resource limitations beyond their control. The debate exposed deep questions about pharmaceutical ethics in an unequal world. Developed nations could use dangerous drugs safely through extensive safeguards. Developing nations lacked resources for those safeguards, but also had greater need for inexpensive, effective treatments. Restricting access to safe only with resources drugs meant the poor couldn't access effective therapies. Thalidomide became a case study in pharmaceutical inequality. The same drug that wealthy countries used safely killed babies in poor countries. The difference wasn't the molecule, but the social and economic context surrounding it. Chemistry was neutral, justice was not. Meanwhile, thalidomide's market value grew substantially. Celgene Corporation, which held American marketing rights, earned billions from thalidomide and derivative compounds. The drug that destroyed Grunenthal's reputation became another company's profit engine. Pharmaceutical economics had rehabilitated what ethics couldn't absolve. Research continued on thalidomide derivatives designed to preserve therapeutic effects while eliminating teratogenic properties. Scientists synthesized hundreds of related molecules seeking that perfect combination. Some showed promise. None achieved thalidomide's full spectrum of benefits without some teratogenic risk. The fundamental problem was that thalidomide's therapeutic and toxic effects emerged from the same mechanisms. Anti-angiogenic properties fought cancer, but also attacked developing blood vessels in embryonic limbs. Immune modulation helped leprosy reactions but disrupted fetal development. The molecule's medical value was inseparable from its reproductive toxicity. This meant thalidomide would never be truly safe during pregnancy. All derivatives carried some risk. The drug's chemical structure dictated biological effects that couldn't be completely separated. Any benefit came with inherent danger requiring eternal vigilance. Original survivors aged into their 60s during the 2010s, facing bodies worn out from lifelong adaptation to profound disabilities. Prosthetics needed replacement. Spinal problems intensified. Pain became chronic and severe. Many required surgeries that would have been unnecessary with normal limb development. Healthcare systems struggled to support aging thalidomide survivors. Their medical needs were complex and expensive. Specialized equipment, repeated surgeries, pain management, psychological support. The costs accumulated relentlessly. Some countries provided comprehensive care. Others offered minimal assistance. The Brazilian children born in the 2000s and 2010s faced similar futures. They were repeating the exact struggles of survivors from the 1960s, learning to adapt without limbs, facing social stigma, requiring extensive medical intervention. The tragedy had literally reproduced itself through regulatory failure and poverty. Pharmaceutical companies continued marketing thalidomide and derivatives worldwide. Sales reached hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The drug remained profitable despite its history and ongoing controversies. Multiple myeloma patients achieved extended survival. Leprosy complications were managed effectively. The medical benefits were genuine and substantial, but every success existed in tension with past and present tragedies. Each life saved through thalidomide therapy was shadowed by memories of destroyed children. Each dollar earned echoed with accusations of profiting from catastrophe. The drug occupied permanent moral grey area between life-saving medication and mass casualty weapon. The paradox was complete and unresolvable. Thalidomide simultaneously represented pharmaceutical industry's greatest failure and a genuinely valuable therapeutic tool. The same molecule that created 10,000 disabled children now extended thousands of cancer patients' lives. The drug was both poison and medicine, destroyer and healer, trauma and treatment. History hadn't resolved into simple narrative. Thalidomide wasn't simply evil or redeemed. It remained permanently complicated, chemically useful, historically toxic, medically valuable, ethically fraught. The drug existed in all these states simultaneously, reflecting the messy reality that chemistry doesn't care about human categories of good and evil, and new babies were still being born without limbs because safety protocols failed where poverty intersected with dangerous drugs. The thalidomide story wasn't finished. It was ongoing. Somewhere in Brazil or India, a woman was taking thalidomide right now, possibly while unknowingly pregnant. The catastrophe was still happening, just more slowly and in places wealthy countries didn't watch carefully. The impossible return was complete. The killer had become healer while remaining killer, and nobody knew how to fully resolve that contradiction. 2024. Approximately 3,000 to 5,000 thalidomide survivors remain alive worldwide, now in their 60s. The exact count is uncertain because many countries never maintained comprehensive registries. Some victims died without ever being officially documented. Others were institutionalized and forgotten by systems that preferred invisible disabilities. The survivors who reached old age face a crisis their bodies were never designed to handle. Human anatomy evolved for standard limb configurations. Compensating for missing or malformed limbs creates stresses that accumulate over decades. Spines curve abnormally. Joints wear out prematurely. Muscles work in unnatural patterns, causing chronic pain. Prosthetic technology has advanced dramatically since the 1960s. Modern devices use microprocessors, responsive sensors, and lightweight materials. But even sophisticated prosthetics can't fully replace biological limbs. Socket interfaces cause skin breakdown. Weight distribution creates pressure problems. Nerve pain intensifies. Many survivors use prosthetics less as they age, finding them more burden than benefit. Germany maintains the most comprehensive support system through the Kontergan Foundation, funded initially by Grunenthal's 1970 settlement and supplemented by government contributions. Survivors receive monthly pensions, medical coverage, and specialized care. The support is substantial but never adequate to fully compensate for lifelong disability. British survivors access support through the Thalidomide Trust, established in 1973 with funds from Distillers Company settlement and government contributions. Payments increased over the decades as politicians recognized initial compensation was grossly insufficient. By the 2010s, severely affected survivors received over $80,000 annually, but many argued this still couldn't compensate for the life they'd lost. American survivors of the 17 confirmed cases received varying compensation through private settlements with Richardson Merrill. No federal program existed since the drug never gained official approval. Some families negotiated substantial payments. Others settled for minimal amounts. The inconsistency reflected American healthcare's fragmented nature. Canadian survivors face similar inconsistency. Provincial governments provided disability support at varying levels. Some provinces offered comprehensive care, others provided minimal assistance. A few survivors lived comfortably with adequate support while others struggled financially, despite identical disabilities caused by the same drug. Japanese survivors confronted cultural stigma that compounded medical challenges. Traditional views of disability as shameful meant many families hid affected children. Some survivors lived isolated lives, rarely appearing in public. Japanese pharmaceutical companies that licensed thalidomide provided limited compensation. Government support was modest. Social acceptance remained difficult. Brazilian survivors from the 1960s watched in horror as the new generation of thalidomide babies joined them. The children born in the 2000s and 2010s faced the same struggles, learning to eat without hands, developing tricks to manipulate objects with feet or mouth, enduring stares and questions. The continuity of suffering across 50 years was unbearable. August 31, 2012, Grunenthal finally issued a formal apology at a memorial unveiling in Stolberg. Company CEO Harold Stock expressed regret and acknowledged the suffering caused. The statement came 50 years after the disaster, long after most executives involved had died. Many saw it as too late and too carefully worded to avoid legal implications. The apology was precisely calibrated by lawyers. Stock expressed sorrow without admitting legal culpability. The company regretted the tragedy while maintaining they'd acted according to standards of their era. The language was designed to show compassion without creating liability for ongoing compensation claims. Survivors' reactions range from appreciation to rage. Some felt vindicated that Grunenthal finally acknowledged wrongdoing even indirectly. Others viewed the apology as meaningless without significant additional compensation or admission of criminal negligence. The company's continued profitability from other drugs while offering only limited apology seemed particularly galling. The fundamental question haunting everyone was whether pharmaceutical industry truly learned thalidomide's lessons. Regulatory systems had been rebuilt. Testing requirements were dramatically more rigorous. Safety monitoring was exponentially more sophisticated. These changes suggested the system had evolved to prevent similar disasters. Yet pharmaceutical catastrophes continued occurring with disturbing regularity. Each followed different patterns but shared common features: inadequate testing, corporate pressure to rush approval, profit motives overwhelming safety concerns, regulatory capture, denial when problems emerged. Diethylstilbestrol, DES, was prescribed to millions of pregnant women from the 1940s through 1971 to prevent miscarriages despite limited evidence of effectiveness. Daughters of women who took DES developed unusual vaginal cancers decades later. The drug's teratogenic effects operated on delayed timescale that escaped detection until too late. Multiple millions were exposed before withdrawal. The mechanism differed from thalidomide, but the pattern was identical. Drug prescribed to pregnant women without adequate safety testing, regulatory failure to demand proper studies, corporate marketing prioritizing profits, delayed recognition of harm, eventual withdrawal after massive damage. The system supposedly reformed after thalidomide had allowed DES catastrophe to unfold over 3 decades. Vioxx represented a different failure mode. Merck's arthritis drug received approval in 1999 after standard testing. Post-market surveillance eventually revealed the medication caused heart attacks and strokes. By the time withdrawal occurred in 2004, Vioxx had killed an estimated 60,000 Americans. The drug passed all regulatory hurdles but was still lethally dangerous to specific populations. Merck faced accusations of suppressing evidence about cardiovascular risks. Internal documents suggested the company knew about heart attack dangers earlier than publicly acknowledged. The litigation revealed familiar patterns: corporate knowledge hidden, profits prioritized over safety, aggressive marketing despite emerging concerns. Thalidomide's lessons seemed forgotten or ignored. The opioid epidemic demonstrated that pharmaceutical disasters didn't require accidental toxicity. Purdue Pharma marketed OxyContin as non-addictive despite knowing this was false. Doctors prescribed opioids aggressively based on misleading company information. Hundreds of thousands died from overdoses directly traceable to pharmaceutical company lying and regulatory failure. Purdue's Sackler family earned billions while American overdose deaths climbed exponentially. The company eventually filed bankruptcy and paid settlements, but the personal wealth remained largely protected. Criminal prosecutions were limited. The pattern was depressingly familiar: massive harm, corporate profit, inadequate accountability, system failure. Each disaster prompted reforms that seemed comprehensive until the next catastrophe revealed new vulnerabilities. After thalidomide came stricter testing. After DES came pregnancy category systems. After Vioxx came enhanced post-market surveillance. After opioids came prescription monitoring databases. Each reform addressed the specific previous failure without preventing novel disasters. The fundamental problem was structural. Pharmaceutical companies operated as profit-maximizing entities in competitive markets. Safety requirements conflicted with financial incentives to move quickly. Regulatory agencies were perpetually understaffed relative to the industries they oversaw. Political pressure encouraged rapid approvals to benefit patients waiting for treatments. This tension was inherent and unresolved. No regulatory system could eliminate risk entirely without also preventing beneficial drugs from reaching patients. The question was always where to draw the line between acceptable risk and unacceptable danger. Thalidomide was clearly beyond any acceptable line, but many cases fell into grey areas. Francis Kelsey's triumph illustrated both system success and its fragility. She prevented American thalidomide catastrophe through personal stubbornness and scientific rigor. But the victory depended on one individual reviewer happening to be unusually careful. If Richardson Merrill's application had been assigned to a different, less thorough reviewer, thousands of American babies might have been deformed. Regulatory systems shouldn't depend on individual heroism. Kelsey's success highlighted that structural protections were inadequate. She was the exception that proved the rule. Most reviewers didn't have a specific combination of pharmacological training, stubbornness, and willingness to resist corporate pressure. The system worked by accident, not design. Modern pharmaceutical regulation was vastly more sophisticated than 1960s procedures. Clinical trials involved thousands of participants across multiple phases. Studies lasted years. Safety monitoring continued after approval. Adverse event reporting was systematic. Pregnancy registries tracked outcomes. The infrastructure was incomparably better. Yet the valsartan contamination crisis showed that even modern systems had serious gaps. In 2018, regulatory agencies discovered that blood pressure medications contained carcinogenic impurities introduced during manufacturing. The contamination had persisted for years, affecting millions of patients. Testing protocols existed but were inadequately implemented. Generic drug manufacturing presented particular challenges. As more medications went off patent, production shifted to facilities in India and China, where regulatory oversight was less rigorous. Contamination scandals emerged regularly. The global pharmaceutical supply chain created vulnerabilities that national regulatory agencies struggled to monitor effectively. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated drug development timelines dramatically. Vaccines moved from concept to approval in under a year through emergency authorization processes. This speed was necessary given the crisis, but raised questions about whether safety shortcuts would become normalized. Thalidomide's lesson was that rushing drugs to market created catastrophic risks. Survivors watched these developments with deep cynicism. They'd lived their entire lives as evidence of what happened when pharmaceutical companies prioritized speed and profit over thorough testing. They were human warnings that apparently required constant repetition because each generation of executives, regulators, and doctors seemed to forget. The physical challenges of aging with thalidomide-induced disabilities were compounded by psychological burdens. Many survivors experienced depression that intensified with age. They'd spent 6 decades adapting to bodies that worked wrong. The effort was exhausting. Pain management became increasingly difficult. Independence decreased as physical capabilities declined. Some survivors found meaning through advocacy and education. They spoke at medical schools, pharmaceutical conferences, and regulatory hearings. Their presence was a powerful reminder of real human consequences behind regulatory abstractions. Seeing an elderly person with flipper arms made pharmaceutical safety tangible in ways data never could. Others preferred privacy, having spent lifetimes being stared at. They'd answered enough questions, endured enough intrusive curiosity, served enough time as living object lessons. They wanted whatever peace remaining years could offer, without being perpetual educational exhibits for people who should already know better. The children born in Brazil and India during the 2000s and 2010s were now teenagers and young adults. They faced the same social challenges original survivors had navigated: dating without normal bodies, finding employment despite obvious disabilities, accessing education in physical spaces designed for able-bodied people. The repetition was tragic and preventable. International health organizations studied why safety protocols worked in wealthy countries but failed in developing nations. The answers were uncomfortable: poverty, inadequate healthcare infrastructure, limited regulatory capacity, cultural barriers to contraception, and simple lack of resources. thalidomide was safe only where society could afford expensive safeguards. This created moral hazard. Should dangerous but effective drugs be available only in wealthy countries that could implement proper safety protocols? That approach protected poor populations from risks, but also denied them access to beneficial treatments. The alternative was accepting preventable tragedies as price of global access. Pharmaceutical companies faced no good options. Restricting thalidomide to developed markets was ethically problematic but safer. Allowing global distribution risked creating new victims wherever systems were inadequate. Whatever choice they made, someone suffered, either from denied access to effective treatment or from preventable birth defects. The original executives at Grunenthal were all dead now. Wilhelm Kunz died in 1970. Heinrich Müchter died in 1987. Hermann Wirtz died in 1988. None faced significant punishment. They'd lived comfortable lives, died of natural causes, and were buried with their reputations damaged but not destroyed. The justice system had utterly failed to hold them accountable. This pattern repeated in subsequent pharmaceutical disasters. Purdue Pharma executives faced some criminal charges, but the Sackler family largely protected their wealth. Merck paid billions in Vioxx settlements, but no executives went to prison. Pharmaceutical companies treated penalties as business costs rather than deterrents. The question of whether another thalidomide-scale disaster could occur remained deeply troubling. Modern regulatory systems were vastly improved. Testing was exponentially more rigorous. Safety monitoring was comprehensive. Yet new vulnerabilities constantly emerged as pharmaceutical science advanced into novel areas. Gene therapy, personalized medicine, and artificial intelligence-driven drug design created situations unprecedented in regulatory history. How do you test personalized treatments designed for individual patients? What safety standards apply to gene therapies that permanently alter human DNA? How do regulators evaluate drugs designed by AI systems operating through mechanisms human scientists don't fully understand? Thalidomide taught that unknown mechanisms created catastrophic risks. The drug worked through pathways not understood until after the disaster. Modern pharmaceutical research moved into areas of similar uncertainty. Each advance opened possibilities for novel therapeutic benefits and equally novel catastrophic risks. The survivors aging into their 60s carried this knowledge in their bodies. Every morning they woke up without arms or legs reminded them that pharmaceutical progress was double-edged. The same industry producing life-saving medications had destroyed their bodies for profit. Trust, once shattered so completely, never fully returned. Some maintained hope that thalidomide's legacy would prevent future disasters. The tragedy was so enormous, so documented, so thoroughly studied, that surely it had permanently changed pharmaceutical culture. The names, Contagon, Distaval, Kevadon, would echo through history as warnings that prevented repetition. Others knew better. They'd watched DES, Vioxx, and opioids unfold. They'd seen new thalidomide babies born in Brazil. They understood that human nature, corporate structure, and economic incentives created perpetual pressure to cut corners. Each disaster prompted reforms that lasted until memory faded and new executives prioritized speed and profit. The elderly survivors looked at modern pharmaceutical industry with the exhausted recognition that comes from living through history others only read about. They knew the cycle would continue. Somewhere, in some laboratory, some compound was being rushed toward approval without adequate testing. Somewhere, corporate executives were minimizing emerging safety signals. Somewhere, regulators were being pressured to approve faster. The tragedy of thalidomide was that it changed everything and nothing. Regulatory systems were rebuilt, but pharmaceutical disasters continued. Testing became rigorous, yet catastrophic failures still occurred. everyone learned the lessons until they forgot them. The survivors carried proof that systems failed catastrophically when speed and profit overwhelmed caution, and they were dying. Each year, fewer remained. By 2030, many would be gone. By 2040, nearly all. Within decades, no living human would carry thalidomide damage in their body. The warning would exist only in textbooks, photographs, and historical accounts. Would future generations remember? Or would the cycle repeat with some new drug, new mechanism, new population of victims? The survivors didn't know. They only knew they'd lived their entire lives as evidence that pharmaceutical companies couldn't always be trusted, regulators weren't always sufficient, and medical progress came with human costs that statistics couldn't capture. Their bodies were permanent testimony to what happened when the careful work of science was corrupted by the urgent demands of commerce. They were living proof that it could happen, and living warnings that it would happen again, somewhere, sometime, unless each new generation relearned the lesson written in their absent limbs, that speed and profit must never ever override the basic human obligation to first do no harm. But they'd watched enough history to know that lesson was forgotten as soon as it was learned. The thalidomide tragedy would never truly end. It would just repeat with different names, different drugs, different victims telling the same story about the same failures. The survivors would die, the drug would persist. And somewhere in the world a woman was taking thalidomide right now, possibly pregnant, trusting systems that had already failed thousands before her. The catastrophe was still happening. It had never stopped. It was just happening slowly enough that wealthy nations could pretend it wasn't real. The legacy of thalidomide wasn't the pharmaceutical disasters ended. The legacy was that they became manageable, predictable, acceptable costs of doing business. 10,000 destroyed children had taught the world how to prevent similar disasters in wealthy countries, while allowing them to continue elsewhere. The lesson learned was how much tragedy could be tolerated, and that might have been the most disturbing lesson of all.